All right, it's time to give a little love to amphibious warfare, and writ large to the United States Marine Corps. So let's put those two together. They seem like, peanut butter and jelly, don't they? Amphibious warfare and the United States Marine Corps have always been together, haven't they? Not quite. Believe it or not, historically speaking, not so much. So how did the United States Marine Corps, and I would say thereby proxy, Marines everywhere, become the undisputed masters of amphibious warfare? Well, it's a good question. Here's how it starts. The Marine Corps, of course, starts, and the Marines were what naval infantry were throughout history. Amphibious warfare certainly been around since we've been sailing, and so the Marines were the protectors of that ship. That is, they provided small arms when they went ship to ship. Battles, back in the days of sail, and there was swashbuckling to clear the deck, swinging across on ropes with saber in between your teeth. I don't know. The point is, that's what Marines did. But the Marines, of course, did amphibious, and I mean all Marines, naval infantry. They, of course, did some amphibious warfare, but by and large, here's how that went. The Navy would pull up to an enemy's port, reduce it enough that the defendants would by and large flee just long enough for the Navy to pull in and disembark their Marines, who then became infantry on foot and ran around, causing all sorts of mayhem. And that's how things went. This does not mean that there was zero beachhead landings and things like that. They certainly did that. They did it for a wide variety of reasons. But it wasn't perfected as an art. As a matter of fact, if we're going to be quite candid about it, after the disaster in World War I at the Battle of Gallipoli, it was believed by many military experts that amphibious warfare was dead. In the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s between the two great world wars, the United States Marine Corps sought to differentiate itself from the United States Army because they had fought so similarly in World War I to the Army. There were people in Congress saying we no longer need the Marine Corps. And the Marines then, I don't want to say desperately, but they wanted to prove that they had value within their own right as a unique Marine force. And so they set about proving that in the interwar period. That glasses pull is for you, Leo Clark. I just wanted you to know that, besides which I didn't want them on when I'm reading my computer. So, the point is that in the interwar period, and I forget the lieutenant colonel's name, that's a shame, I really should know that. But a young lieutenant colonel tried to convince his superiors that, in fact, amphibious warfare was quite viable. And so he put forth and somewhat rehearsed a pretty exhaustive doctrine that in World War II in the Pacific Theater was put to use almost immediately. Of course, it saw use in the African theater, the China, Burma, India theater, and several times within the European theater, Sicily and Italy and northern France and southern France, all amphibious invasions. It is proven as a concept by the United States Marine Corps by the end of World War II, and the United States Marines are the undisputed masters by that time. So now I'm going to talk about amphibious warfare once again because it's such a ginormous topic that I can only talk about it in this time in sweeping generalizations. And so bear with me. It's been with us for a while. Today, we no longer see the grandiose, at least for the American military, we no longer see the grandiose, large-scale amphibious operations that we saw in World War II and the Korean War. But certainly, we've seen amphibious operations continue since then, and the Marines are still the master of this. There are multiple reasons why you might conduct an assault, even though I, again, notice that they are getting smaller in scale, and they're very, very targeted assaults and attacks. There still are multiple reasons why we might want to do this. The four that are most prominent in my mind are the obvious, is the amphibious assault, right? So we want to conduct a deliberate attack from the sea to the coast, along a coastline, to seize a beachhead, and we do that primarily so that follow-on forces from the seas can move in and exploit that beachhead that we've maintained or obtained. And that's one way. So you can continue to go in. You see this again throughout World War II and the Korean War. But again, you see this other places. I mean, you even saw it in Somalia, right, back in the early 1990s. So that's one thing, is to conduct an amphibious assault. The second thing is an amphibious raid. That's the second reason. And this is a swift but temporary attack from the sea along a coastline with the intent to either destroy or capture enemy resources, or sometimes it's done as a deceptive operations, battlefield deception. You know, get the enemy to look over here when you're doing something else over here. So that's an amphibious raid. An amphibious withdrawal, well, of course, that's the recovery of forces along a coastline by seaborne forces, and it's conducted strategically to withdraw forces that may not be Marine forces. They, you know, think of Dunkirk, right? This is a strategic retreat. So it can be something like this, or it can be conducted tactically at smaller unit levels under enemy pressure. And of course, that's seen very much today. It might involve brown water navies, you know, and all sorts of different types of vessels and technologies. But we're picking up smaller forces under tactical pressure, and we're pulling away, often clandestinely, not always. Sometimes it's out in the open, it's, you know, overt operations. But those are amphibious withdrawals. Lastly is the amphibious demonstration. Now, the demonstration is the massing. It is coming together to conduct an amphibious assault, or at least appearing to, in order to display strategic resolve. That is, we're trying to convince an enemy, a potential enemy or an antagonist, that our resolve is here to take action. In most of those cases, or at least many of those cases, the amphibious assault isn't actually conducted. It doesn't actually ever come. This can also be a form of operational deception on the battlefield. And a classic case of that is the 1991 war with Iraq to retake Kuwait. You know, a Marine division was positioned and massed together off the coast of Kuwait to conduct an amphibious attack and seize Kuwait City, to gain access into Kuwait City and stuff like this. That attack never happened, but what did happen was the Iraqis dedicated several divisions, rather than putting them other places to fight, you know, the coalition. They dedicated them to holding their coastline, you know, against the Marines, who, again, it was all tactical deception. So that's an amphibious demonstration, or at least one example of different types. I've already said the United States Marine Corps was the undisputed master by the end of World War II, and I think that that's absolutely true. But let's give credit where it's due. Most Marine forces, naval infantry forces, since that time have copied and tailor-made that doctrine to suit their own purposes. So rather than focus on a U.S.-centric discussion on amphibious warfare, I think that's a bit unfair. You know, we could throw around words like the JFLC or CJFLC, that is the Joint Forces Land Component Commander, the JFLC, or CJFLC, the Combined Joint Forces Land Component Commanders. You know, and we can use U.S. esoteric terms, but I'd rather go to more simplistic terms because they're more universal, right? So when we think about an amphibious operation, be that a company size or battalion size attack, right, or operation, or whether that's at brigade, division, or even something 250,000 like, you know, Normandy, right? This is an army group supported by naval and air forces. The point is that you have one commander, and that's typically called a CATF or CATF, the Commander Amphibious Task Force. That naval commander is actually in command of surface forces, so the naval surface forces, the air forces, Army, Marine, Navy, doesn't matter, the air forces, and the land forces. And, you know, and that's in getting them all to the staging area whereby we are now going to conduct operations, offensive operations against, you know, a beachhead somewhere. The CATF, or is the naval commander who's in charge of all this. And I point this out and belabor it because they are in charge. The naval force is in charge all the way up until the point that they aren't. And that's really delicate. So you have to juggle this. This is one of the failures that was noted in Gallipoli, was that the naval forces were in charge of all of it. And though there wasn't much of an air force, they were never really involved as the command. Furthermore, when the land forces got onto ground, the Navy retained control. The land forces didn't exploit their beachhead either in Gallipoli. And there's many good reasons, there's logical reasons why they didn't, but it was still catastrophic. One of the reasons was, frankly, the Navy had the guns. The Navy had the guns that could go inland and give their artillery support. And the Army just didn't have heavy enough artillery, so they couldn't independently move in. But it's more than that. Your lines of communication are your logistics. So how are you going to get ammunition, water, food from the naval forces that are a flotilla, in the bay as you move 25 miles inward? The enemy, the Turks, could simply cut off your lines of communication, and then where are you? Not in an enviable position. Even more so, there's other types of logistics that you're concerned about. How do I evacuate my wounded? That can be morale crushing when you can't evacuate your wounded. So the Army wasn't very keen to leave the Navy at Gallipoli, and the Navy, at any rate, wasn't about to let them. And so the Turks were able to send in reinforcements by railhead, by trains and vehicles and foot, and over a long period of time simply held the enemy in an enclave on their beachhead and just bombarded, the living hell out of them. And it didn't work out well, and they wound up doing a withdrawal. And Gallipoli is known as a disaster, and some people say an unnecessary disaster. Modern doctrine says we have to unwrap that. We have to correct that. So the naval commander is in control until such times as the land forces have seized a foothold on the beachhead, and those conditions are clearly negotiated as to when the CLF, cliff, when the commander landing force takes over. The Navy is in the senior position until a beachhead is secured to the conditions appropriate that the commander landing force takes over, and then the commander landing force is in control. But there is also the CAF, the commanding air force. The commander air force, of course, handles all the air reconnaissance assets as well as the air attack forces. And so while they play a secondary role to the Navy in protecting the amphibious task force, while they play a secondary role into the CLF, Commander of Landing Forces, protecting the ground forces, right, and supporting them directly, they still need their own command, because the air forces are bring very unique capabilities to amphibious landings and amphibious warfare. And so there you go. You have the CATF, the CAF, and the CLF. As we'll explore here on the board what that kind of looks like, and again, a sweeping overview of it. Keep those three in mind, because those really are the three commands, and the synchronization between them is what makes the difference between success and failure in amphibious landings. All right, let's go to the whiteboard. Let's talk about the mess we have here on the whiteboard. First off, this is our naval amphibious task force, right? Think about something like the Falklands. It had to go thousands and thousands of miles to the other side of the earth, right? So how far is it coming from? I don't know. You need one hell of a blue water navy to project force like we're going to discuss, because this is not just aircraft carriers and or battleships or surface vessels capable of firing, cruise missiles into the enemy space, but it also has to be able to bring all sorts of troop carriers and logistical support. And it's got submarines to protect the force as well as aircraft. So we're protecting this force in so many domains: under the water, on the surface, in the air, in space, in cyber. We've got to protect this force, because as we project it forward, in spite of all of its incredible firepower, it still can be incredibly vulnerable. And so we project our force there, and there's a whole lot that goes into just getting here. And you can see why the Navy is in charge of this task force, not the Army and not the Air Force. But at this point, the Navy is coordinating very carefully with the Air Force and even Space Force, not making a joke there. They really are, in order to project this, because the Army is really just a passenger here, or the Marines for that matter. As we come closer to the shoreline, and this is the shoreline with enemy strong points, there's an airport, there's some kind of city, and you can see the strong point defenses of the enemy along the coastline. As our naval task force comes within striking distance, there's all sorts of landborne or airborne anti-ship missiles and weapon systems here. The Silkworm and the Exocet and all this stuff. So again, great vulnerabilities here, and they've got to come within striking distance. Well, if we can strike land, if we've got a pure military, they can strike us. And so some element of surprise is certainly welcomed, but we must assume that the enemy has had opportunity to put in its defenses, and hopefully our intelligence is showing us where the weaker places are that we can attack, because we don't want to go into the teeth of the lion, right? We want to avoid that if we absolutely can. Unlike in World War II, where there was a prolonged softening up of artillery and air attack against the enemy, that may not be the case anymore, simply because the longer we stay out here, and it was certainly true in World War II, but now more so, the more vulnerable this naval task force is, that amphibious task force. So, Navy's still in charge. Navy is, flying its defense for the task force itself. This is a vertical envelopment, but it also indicates air attack. The commander of the Air Force, be they Marine, be they Navy, or Air Force, they're going to coordinate their involvement here. And so I've got that just loosely indicated here, and I'll talk about what that means. And then my dotted line here means naval gunfires. And so whatever that looks like, I don't care if that's literally cannon off the deck of a ship, or if it's, cruise missiles or whatever it is, but we've got that involved too. So I'm trying to illustrate that there is a combined arms force here at play for these amphibious landings. The other thing, of course, is through our intelligence and everything else, we've earmarked the vulnerable places. This is our primary, I'm going to say in this case. This is more of a holding action. We want to engage them so that they can't maneuver to this. This is the sweet spot between the lion's teeth. And this also is a bit of a holding action, or it may even be a deception. We may choose not to land here. But certainly what we're going to do is our fires have to disrupt the enemy. They disrupt the enemy. You're saying, oh, they suppress them. Yeah, okay, that's part of it. But the bigger part is the disruption stops their communications. It stops their logistical supply. And here's a big one. It stops their units from being able to move about the battle space freely to reposition and attack us where we are most vulnerable. So an air war certainly does that. It blows up and destroys and reduces enemy assets, but equally as important, it denies the enemy freedom of maneuver. So that's what our air assets are doing, and that you can see that right here. We've got a city. We're trying to separate the logistics and the communication coming from that city to support this defensive position. We're convincing this defensive position that we are in fact going to attack. And oh, by the way, in your pocket you should have the ability to actually attack. You want to convince them that you're sincere about your attack in this demonstration over here. If you really want to convince them, be ready to attack. When we talk about Kuwait, the Marines did intend to attack. And so the Iraqis were right to defend their coastline, but it just turned out that it wasn't necessary. It turned out to be a demonstration. And that's what we're doing here. We are separating this defensive line from its lines of communication, its lines of support. If there are, into that airport, if there are reinforcing units coming into a train port or an airport, right? This is our effort to disrupt that. Or if they're trying to escape, maybe we want to disrupt that. But either way, we need to make them believe, hey, we're coming here. So they keep that force there. And then we, like I said, then we start destroying through air assets. We start, and close air support and all of that, strategic bombing. We start destroying enemy assets of resistance, and we pin the enemy down. And why we're doing that? Well, again, this may or may not be a demonstration, but let's say that that's our intent right now, is we're hoping not to actually disembark. This is going to be a real tough nut to crack, but that's what we're trying to do. We're going to try to get to one end and keep it away from our landing forces here, and this will be our primary effort, the beachhead we hope to secure. This is our primary. This could be our secondary, this could be our tertiary, whatever the case, or vice versa, right? If things don't go well here, we want other options. What happens is the amphibious force has to disembark from the ships, come into a holding pattern, and then in turn each one is dedicated. So this is probably number one. I'm going to send them first so they engage these people and convince them, oh, the attack's going here. I don't know, this probably be third if I'm, I just want them to know, yep, they're coming for us. And this might be my second line of effort. But either way, I've got to get them here into a holding pattern until I get them all disembarked. And so then they come out here, and then when they get to a breaking point, they go into their waves. When we land, again, we're going to use smoke. We're going to use anything we can to conceal our attack forces, plural. We're going to use indirect fires, naval gunfire, close air support to further destroy, isolate, and disrupt our enemy. And that's how we're going to actually wind up our forces. This is, of course, combined arms. This will be infantry. It'll be mechanized infantry. It'll be armor. It may be artillery. There'll be engineer assets that come in. But we have got to seize an appreciable level. Once that appreciable level, let's say our primary is done, that's when the combined land forces actually takes over this mission. Now, the Navy is still dedicated to the Army of the Marine, the land force here, but the land forces take over and they have to defeat the enemy inland. Furthermore, there's probably follow-on forces, either through surface, like Navy, the follow-on force to continue the invasion, or we may then go ahead and seize other ports, such as airports, whereby we can fly in with air assets to reinforce this effort. This is a big overview of something that's incredibly complex, but this is how we're doing it. I don't want you guys to think, it's a single beach and, and then we send everything forward. I'm like, no, that wouldn't work. The rest of the enemy is going to see this and they're going to simply come and repel us. So it's far more complex than that. And if you look at something, for example, Normandy is a good example. You did have deception operations going on at Calais. You did have a primary and secondary beachhead support. You had an extended air campaign, but not so much as it gives away the exact location, right? The other thing is you had airborne forces dropping in to seize bridges, road junctions, and even townships, so these follow-on forces could go on in. Are we looking at dropping off a battalion? Are we looking at dropping off, 250,000 troops? It is MET-TC dependent, right? So, but that's just kind of an overview of how amphibious operations happen. And again, what's kind of cool about the Marines is, at least the United States Marines, they say a Marine is a Marine. They don't think of Marines in terms of, well, these are air assault Marines, and these are mechanized Marines, and these are light infantry Marines. Marines are Marines, right? And the infantry is the infantry. But that said, they have light armor reconnaissance battalions. They have air assault battalions and companies. The infantry on the Amtraks, once they get to ground, they can just up and leave because the Amtraks don't belong to that infantry. The military would define them as basically light infantry dismounts, just catching a ride to the shore. So it's interesting to me that in spite of the fact that the Marine Corps rarely defines themselves in those terms, you see all of that represented in the MAGTF or, in amphibious warfare anyway. Again, just wanting to shed some love on, one of the combat environments that we rarely talk about and, this channel, and that is amphibious warfare. Yet, amphibious warfare is still very much viable today because the Marines were the, modern day designers. They recreated this after the disaster at Gallipoli in the interwar years. There's a notion that, Marines do that and the Army doesn't. Well, that's not quite fair. It was primarily the Army, though trained by the Marines, it was primarily the Army in North Africa, in the underbelly of, Europe, that is, Sicily and Italy. And it was Army landings again in Normandy and then all the way down in southern France. And so you see them repeatedly doing these kind of operations, and massively huge when you look at the two, some of the biggest in history are, of course, Normandy, well known, but also the Philippines. The Army retook the Philippines in World War II. That was, again, trained by Marines, but it wasn't Marines. Marines were a more direct route of island hopping towards the mainland, whereas the Army was coming up through the Philippines towards Japan from the south to the north. And so the Army has been involved for a very, very long time in massive amphibious operations as well. And so you'll notice I keep saying Army, but more commonly, definitely more commonly done by the Marines, not to take anything away from them. And again, they are really the designers and inventors of our modern concept of amphibious operations. Okay, thanks for joining us.